This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by George Coots, September 2006. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. Chapter 63. The Dinner. It was evident that one sentiment affected all the guests on entering the dining room. Each one asked what strange influence had brought them to this house, and yet astonished, even uneasy though they were, they still felt that they would not like to be absent. The recent events, the solitary and eccentric position of the Count, his enormous, nay, almost incredible fortune, should have made men cautious, and have altogether prevented ladies visiting a house where there was no one of their own sex to receive them. And yet curiosity had been enough to lead them to overleap the bounds of prudence and decorum, and all present, even including Cavalcanti and his son, notwithstanding the stiffness of the one and the carelessness of the other, were thoughtful on finding themselves assembled at the house of this incomprehensible man. Madame Danglars had started when Villefort, on the Count's invitation, offered his arm, and Villefort felt that his glance was uneasy beneath his gold spectacles when he felt the arm of the Baroness press upon his own. None of this had escaped the Count, and even by this mere contact of individuals, the scene had already acquired considerable interest for an observer. M. de Villefort had on the right hand Madame Danglars, and on his left Morrel. The Count was seated between Madame de Villefort and Danglars. The other seats were filled by Debray, who was placed between the two Cavalcanti, and by Chateau Renaud, seated between Madame de Villefort and Morrel. The repast was magnificent. Monte Cristo had endeavored completely to overturn the Parisian ideas, and to feed the curiosity as much as the appetite of his guests. It was an oriental feast that he offered to them, but of such a kind as the Arabian fairies might be supposed to prepare. Every delicious fruit that the 4 quarters of the globe could provide was heaped in vases from China and jars from Japan. Rare birds retaining their most brilliant plumage, enormous fish spread upon massive silver dishes, together with every wine produced in the archipelago, Asia Minor, or the Cape, sparkling in bottles, whose grotesque shape seemed to give an additional flavor to the draught. All these, like one of the displays with which Apicius of old gratified his guests, passed in review before the eyes of the astonished Parisians, who understood that it was possible to expend 1,000 louis upon a dinner for 10 persons, but only on the condition of eating pearls, like Cleopatra, or drinking refined gold, like Lorenzo de Medici. Monte Cristo noticed the general astonishment, and began laughing and joking about it. "Gentlemen," he said, "you will admit that, when arrived at a certain degree of fortune, the superfluities of life are all that can be desired. And the ladies will allow that, after having risen to a certain eminence of position, the ideal alone can be more exalted. Now, to follow out this reasoning, what is the marvelous? That which we do not understand. What is it that we really desire? That which we cannot obtain. Now, to see things which I cannot understand, to procure impossibilities, these are the study of my life. I gratify my wishes by 2 means, my will and my money. I take as much interest in the pursuit of some whim as you do, M. Danglars, in promoting a new railway line, you, M. de Villefort, in condemning a culprit to death, you, M. Debray, in pacifying a kingdom, you, de Chateau Renaud, in pleasing a woman, and you, Morrel, in breaking a horse that no one can ride. For example, you see these 2 fish, one brought 50 leagues beyond St. Petersburg, the other 5 leagues from Naples. Is it not amusing to see them both on the same table?" "What are the 2 fish?" asked Danglars. M. Chateau Renaud, who has lived in Russia, will tell you the name of one, and Major Cavalcanti, who is an Italian, will tell you the name of the other. "This one is, I think, a sterlet," said Chateau Renaud, "and that one, if I mistake not, a lamprey." "Just so. Now, M. Danglars, ask these gentlemen where they are caught." Starlets, said Chateau Renaud, are only found in the Volga. And, said Cavalcanti, I know that Lake Fusaro alone supplies lampreys of that size. Exactly. One comes from the Volga, and the other from Lake Fusaro. Impossible, cried all the guests simultaneously. Well, this is just what amuses me, said Monte Cristo. I am like Nero, cupitor impossibilium, and that is what is amusing you at this moment. This fish, which seems so exquisite to you, is very likely no better than perch or salmon, but it seemed impossible to procure it, and here it is. But how could you have these fish brought to France? Oh, nothing more easy. Each fish was brought over in a cask, one filled with river herbs and weeds, the other with rushes and lake plants. They were placed in a wagon built on purpose, and thus the sterlet lived 12 days, the lamprey 8, and both were alive when my cook seized them, killing one with milk and the other with wine. You did not believe me, M. Danglars. I cannot help doubting, answered Danglars with his stupid smile. Baptistin, said the count, have the other fish brought in, the sterlet and the lamprey, which came in the other casks, and which are yet alive. Danglars opened his bewildered eyes. The company clapped their hands. 4 servants carried in 2 casks covered with aquatic plants, and in each of which was breathing a fish similar to those on the table. But why have 2 of each sort? Asked Danglars. Merely because one might have died, carelessly answered Monte Cristo. You are certainly an extraordinary man, said Danglars, and philosophers may well say it is a fine thing to be rich. And to have ideas, added Madame Danglars. Oh, do not give me credit for this, madame. It was done by the Romans, who much esteemed them. And Pliny relates that they sent slaves from Ostia to Rome, who carried on their heads fish which he calls the mollusks, and which from the description must probably be the goldfish. It was also considered a luxury to have them alive, it being an amusing sight to see them die, for when dying they change color 3 or 4 times, and like the rainbow when it disappears, passed through all the prismatic shades, after which they were sent to the kitchen. Their agony formed part of their merit. If they were not seen alive, they were despised when dead. Yes, said Debray, but then Ostia is only a few leagues from Rome. True, said Monte Cristo, but what would be the use of living 1800 years after Lucullus, if we can do no better than he could? The 2 Cavalcanti opened their enormous eyes, but had the good sense not to say anything. All this is very extraordinary, said Chateau Renaud. Still, what I admire the most, I confess, is the marvelous promptitude with which your orders are executed. Is it not true that you only bought this house 5 or 6 days ago? Certainly not longer. Well, I am sure it is quite transformed since last week. If I remember rightly, it had another entrance, and the courtyard was paved and empty, while today we have a splendid lawn, bordered by trees which appear to be 100 years old. Why not? I am fond of grass and shade, said Monte Cristo. Yes, said Madame de Villefort. The door was towards the road before, and on the day of my miraculous escape you brought me into the house from the road. I remember. Yes, madame, said Monte Cristo, but I preferred having an entrance which would allow me to see the Bois de Boulogne over my garden. In 4 days, said Morel. It is extraordinary. Indeed, said Chateau Renaud, it seems quite miraculous to make a new house out of an old one, for it was very old and dull too. I recollect coming for my mother to look at it when M. de Saint-Méran advertised it for sale 2 or 3 years ago. M. de Saint-Méran, said Madame de Villefort. Then this house belonged to M. de Saint-Méran before you bought it? It appears so, replied Monte Cristo. Is it possible that you did not know of whom you purchased it? Quite so. My steward transacts all this business for me. It is certainly 10 years since the house had been occupied, said Chateau Renaud, and it was quite melancholy to look at, with the blinds closed, the doors locked, and the weeds in the court. Really, if the house had not belonged to the father-in-law of the procurer, one might have thought it some accursed place where a horrible crime had been committed. Villefort, who had hitherto not tasted the 3 or 4 glasses of rare wine which were placed before him, here took one and drank it off. Monte Cristo allowed a short time to elapse, and then said, "It is singular, Baron, but the same idea came across me the first time I came here. It looked so gloomy I should never have bought it if my steward had not taken the matter into his own hands. Perhaps the fellow had been bribed by the notary. It is probable, stammered out Villefort, trying to smile, but I can assure you that I had nothing to do with any such proceeding. This house is part of Valentine's marriage portion, and M. de Saint-Méran wished to sell it, for if it had remained another year or two uninhabited, it would have fallen to ruin. It was Morrel's turn to become pale. There was, above all, one room, continued Monte Cristo, very plain in appearance, hung with red damask, which I know not why, appeared to be quite dramatic. Why so? Said Danglars. Why dramatic? Can we account for instinct? Said Monte Cristo. Are there not some places where we seem to breathe sadness? Why we cannot tell. It is a chain of recollections, an idea which carries you back to other times, to other places, which very likely have no connection with the present time and place. And there is something in this room which reminds me forcibly of the chamber of the Marquise de Ganges, or Desdemona. Footnote. Elizabeth de Rossan, Marquise de Ganges, was one of the famous women of the court of Louis XIV, where she was known as La Belle Provençale. She was the widow of the Marquise de Castellane when she married de Ganges, and having the misfortune to excite the enmity of her new brothers-in-law, was forced by them to take poison, and they finished her off with pistol and dagger. End footnote. Stay. Since we have finished dinner, I will show it to you, and then we will take coffee in the garden. After dinner, the play. Monte Cristo looked inquiringly at his guests. Madame de Villefort rose. Monte Cristo did the same, and the rest followed their example. Villefort and Madame Danglars remained for a moment, as if rooted to their seats. They questioned each other with vague and stupid glances. "Did you hear?" said Madame Danglars. "We must go," replied Villefort, offering his arm. The others, attracted by curiosity, were already scattered in different parts of the house, for they thought the visit would not be limited to the one room, and that at the same time they would obtain a view of the rest of the building, of which Monte Cristo had created a palace. Each one went out by the open doors. Monte Cristo waited for the two who remained. Then, when they had passed, he brought up the rear, and on his face was a smile which, if they would have understood it, would have alarmed them much more than a visit to the room they were about to enter. They began by walking through the apartments, many of which were fitted up in the Eastern style, with cushions and divans instead of beds, and pipes instead of furniture. The drawing-rooms were decorated with the rarest pictures by the old masters. The boudoirs hung with draperies from China, of fanciful colors, fantastic design, and wonderful texture. At length they arrived at the famous room. There was nothing particular about it, excepting that, although daylight had disappeared, it was not lighted, and everything in it was old-fashioned, while the rest of the rooms had been redecorated. These two causes were enough to give it a gloomy aspect. "Oh," cried Madame de Villefort, "it is really frightful." Madame Danglars tried to utter a few words, but was not heard. Many observations were made, the import of which was unanimous opinion that there was something sinister about the room. "Is it not so?" asked Monte Cristo. "Look at that large clumsy bed, hung with such gloomy blood-colored drapery, and those two crayon portraits that have faded from the dampness. Do they not seem to say, with their pale lips and staring eyes, 'We have seen'?" Villefort became livid. Madame Danglars fell into a long seat placed near the chimney. "Oh," said Madame de Villefort, smiling, "are you courageous enough to sit down upon the very seat, perhaps upon which the crime was committed?" Madame Danglars rose suddenly. "And then," said Monte Cristo, "this is not all." "What is there more?" said Debray, who had not failed to notice the agitation of Madame Danglars. "Ah, what else is there?" said Danglars, "for at present I cannot say that I have seen anything extraordinary. What do you say, M. Cavalcanti?" "Ah," he said, "we have at Pisa Ugolino's tower, at Ferrara Tasso's prison, at Rimini the room of Francesca and Paolo." "Yes, but you have not this little staircase," said Monte Cristo, opening a door concealed by the drapery. "Look at it and tell me what you think of it." What a wicked-looking crooked staircase, said Chateau Renaud with a smile. I do not know whether the wine of Chios produces melancholy, but certainly everything appears to me black in this house, said Debray. Ever since Valentine's dowry had been mentioned, Morel had been silent and sad. Can you imagine, said Monte Cristo, some Othello or Abbé de Ganges, one stormy dark night descending these stairs step by step, carrying a load which he wishes to hide from the sight of man, if not from God? Madame Danglars half fainted on the arm of Villefort, who was obliged to support himself against the wall. Ah, madame, cried Debray, what is the matter with you? How pale you look! It is very evident what is the matter with her, said Madame de Villefort. M. de Monte Cristo is relating horrible stories to us, doubtless intending to frighten us to death. Yes, said Villefort. Really, Count, you frighten the ladies. What is the matter? Asked Debray, in a whisper of Madame Danglars. Nothing, she replied with a violent effort. I want air, that is all. Will you come into the garden? Said Debray, advancing toward the back staircase. No, no, she answered. I would rather remain here. Are you really frightened, madame? Said Monte Cristo. Oh, no, sir, said Madame Danglars. But you suppose scenes in a manner which gives them the appearance of reality. Ah, yes, said Monte Cristo, smiling. It is all a matter of imagination. Why should we not imagine this the apartment of an honest mother, and this bed with red hangings, a bed visited by the goddess Luciana, and that mysterious staircase, the passage through which, not to disturb their sleep, the doctor and nurse pass, or even the father carrying the sleeping child? Here Madame Danglars, instead of being calmed by the soft picture, uttered a groan and fainted. Madame Danglars is ill, said Villefort. It would be better to take her to her carriage. Oh, mon Dieu, said Monte Cristo, I have forgotten my smelling bottle. I have mine, said Madame de Villefort, and she passed over to Monte Cristo a bottle full of the same kind of red liquid whose good properties the Count had tested on Edward. Ah, said Monte Cristo, taking it from her hand. Yes, she said, at your advice I have made the trial. And have you succeeded? I think so. Madame Danglars was carried into the adjoining room. Monte Cristo dropped a very small portion of the red liquid upon her lips. She returned to consciousness. Ah, she cried, what a frightful dream! Villefort pressed her hand to let her know it was not a dream. They looked for M. Danglars, but as he was not especially interested in poetical ideas, he had gone into the garden and was talking with Major Cavalcanti on the projected railway from Leghorn to Florence. Monte Cristo seemed in despair. He took the arm of Madame Danglars and conducted her into the garden, where they found Danglars taking coffee between the Cavalcanti. Really, madame, he said, did I alarm you much? Oh, no, sir, she answered. But you know, things impress us differently, according to the mood of our minds. Villefort forced a laugh. And then, you know, he said, an idea, a supposition, is sufficient. Well, said Monte Cristo, you may believe me if you like, but it is my opinion that a crime has been committed in this house. Take care, said Madame de Villefort. The king's attorney is here. Ah, replied Monte Cristo, since that is the case, I will take advantage of his presence to make my declaration. Your declaration, said Villefort. Yes, before witnesses. Oh, this is very interesting, said Debray. If there really has been a crime, we will investigate it. There has been a crime, said Monte Cristo. Come this way, gentlemen. Come, and Villefort, for a declaration to be available should be made before the competent authorities. He then took Villefort's arm, and at the same time, holding that of Madame Danglars under his own, he dragged the procureur to the plantain tree, where the shade was thickest. All the other guests followed. Stay, said Monte Cristo, here, in this very spot, and he stamped upon the ground. I had the earth dug up and fresh mold put in, to refresh these old trees. Well, my man digging found a box, or rather the ironwork of a box, in the midst of which was the skeleton of a newly born infant. Monte Cristo felt the arm of Madame Danglars stiffen, while that of Villefort trembled. A newly born infant, repeated Debray. This affair becomes serious. Well, said Chateau Renaud, I was not wrong just now then, when I said that houses had souls and faces like men, and that their exteriors carried the impress of their characters. This house was gloomy because it was remorseful. It was remorseful because it concealed a crime. Who said it was a crime? Asked Villefort with a last effort. How? Is it not a crime to bury a living child in a garden? Cried Monte Cristo. And pray, what do you call such an action? But who said it was buried alive? Why bury it there if it were dead? This garden has never been a cemetery. What is done to infanticides in this country? Asked Major Cavalcanti innocently. Oh, their heads are soon cut off, said Danglars. Ah, indeed, said Cavalcanti. I think so. Am I not right, M. de Villefort? Asked Monte Cristo. Yes, Count, replied Villefort, in a voice now scarcely human. Monte Cristo, seeing that the two persons for whom he had prepared this scene could scarcely endure it, and not wishing to carry it too far, said, Come, gentlemen, some coffee. We seem to have forgotten it. And he conducted the guests back to the table on the lawn. Indeed, Count, said Madame Danglars, I am ashamed to own it, but all your frightful stories have so upset me that I must beg you to let me sit down. And she fell into the chair. Monte Cristo bowed and went to Madame de Villefort. I think Madame Danglars again requires your bottle, he said. But before Madame de Villefort could reach her friend, the procureur had found time to whisper to Madame Danglars, I must speak with you. When? Tomorrow. Where? In my office, or in the court if you like. That is the surest place. I will be there. At this moment Madame de Villefort approached. Thanks, my dear friend, said Madame Danglars, trying to smile. It is over now, and I am much better. End of chapter 63.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by CBW Simon, www.canadianblackwatch.com. September 2006. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. Chapter 64. The Beggar. The evening passed on. Madame de Villefort expressed a desire to return to Paris, which Madame Danglars had not dared to do, notwithstanding the uneasiness she experienced. On his wife's request, M. de Villefort was the first to give the signal of departure. He offered his seat in his landau to Madame Danglars, that she might be under the care of his wife. As for M. Danglars, absorbed in an interesting conversation with M. Cavalcanti, he paid no attention to anything that was passing. While Monte Cristo had begged the smelling bottle from Madame de Villefort, he had noticed the approach of Villefort to Madame Danglars, and he soon guessed all that had passed between them, though the words had been uttered in so low a voice as to hardly be heard by Madame Danglars. Without opposing their arrangements, he allowed Morel, Chateau Renaud, and Debray to leave on horseback, and the ladies in M. de Villefort's carriage. Danglars, more and more delighted with Major Cavalcanti, had offered him a seat in his carriage. Andrea Cavalcanti found his tilbury waiting at the door. The groom, in every respect a caricature of the English fashion, was standing on tiptoe to hold a large iron-gray horse. Andrea had spoken very little during dinner. He was an intelligent lad, and he feared to utter some absurdity before so many grand people, amongst whom, with dilating eyes, he saw the king's attorney. Then he had been seized upon by Danglars, who, with a rapid glance at the stiff-necked old major and his modest son, and taking into consideration the hospitality of the Count, made up his mind that he was in the society of some nabob come to Paris to finish the worldly education of his heir. He contemplated with unspeakable delight the large diamond which shone on the major's little finger, for the major, like a prudent man, in case of any accident happening to his banknotes, had immediately converted them into an available asset. Then, after dinner, on the pretext of business, he questioned the father and son upon their mode of living, and the father and son, previously informed that it was through Danglars the one was to receive his 48,000 francs, and the other 50,000 livres annually, were so full of affability that they would have shaken hands even with the banker's servants. So much did their gratitude need an object to expend itself upon. One thing above all the rest heightened the respect, nay, almost the veneration of Danglars for Cavalcanti. The latter, faithful to the principle of Horace nil admirari, had contented himself with showing his knowledge by declaring in what lake the best lampreys were caught. Then he had eaten some without saying a word more. Danglars, therefore, concluded that such luxuries were common at the table of the illustrious descendant of the Cavalcanti, who most likely in Lucca fed upon trout brought from Switzerland, and lobsters sent from England, by the same means used by the Count to bring the lampreys from Lake Fusaro and the sterlet from the Volga. Thus it was with much politeness of manner that he heard Cavalcanti pronounce these words: "Tomorrow, sir, I shall have the honor of waiting upon you on business." "And I, sir," said Danglars, "shall be most happy to receive you." Upon which he offered to take Cavalcanti in his carriage to the Hôtel des Princes, if it would not be depriving him of the company of his son. To this Cavalcanti replied by saying that for some time past his son had lived independently of him, that he had his own horses and carriages, and that not having come together, it would not be difficult for them to leave separately. The Major seated himself, therefore, by the side of Danglars, who was more and more charmed with the ideas of order and economy which ruled this man, and yet who, being able to allow his son 60,000 francs a year, might be supposed to possess a fortune of 500,000 or 600,000 livres. As for Andrea, he began, by way of showing off, to scold his groom, who, instead of bringing the tilbury to the steps of the house, had taken it to the outer door, thus giving him the trouble of walking 30 steps to reach it. The groom heard him with humility, took the bit of the impatient animal with his left hand, and with the right held out the reins to Andrea, who, taking them from him, rested his polished boot lightly on the step. At that moment a hand touched his shoulder. The young man turned round, thinking that Danglars or Monte Cristo had forgotten something they wished to tell him, and had returned just as they were starting. But instead of either of these, he saw nothing but a strange face, sunburnt, and encircled by a beard, with eyes brilliant as carbuncles, and a smile upon the mouth which displayed a perfect set of white teeth, pointed and sharp as the wolf's or jackal's. A red handkerchief encircled his grey head. Torn and filthy garments covered his large bony limbs, which seemed as though, like those of a skeleton, they would rattle as he walked. And the hand with which he leaned upon the young man's shoulder, and which was the first thing Andrea saw, seemed of gigantic size. Did the young man recognize that face by the light of the lantern in his tilbury, or was he merely struck with the horrible appearance of his interrogator? We cannot say, but only relate the fact that he shuddered and stepped back suddenly. "What do you want of me?" he asked. "Pardon me, my friend, if I disturb you," said the man with the red handkerchief, "but I want to speak to you." "You have no right to beg at night," said the groom, endeavoring to rid his master of the troublesome intruder. "I am not begging, my fine fellow," said the unknown to the servant, with so ironical an expression of the eye, and so frightful a smile, that he withdrew. "I only wish to say 2 or 3 words to your master, who gave me a commission to execute about a fortnight ago." "Come," said Andrea, with sufficient nerve for his servant not to perceive his agitation. "What do you want? Speak quickly, friend." The man said in a low voice, I wish you to spare me the walk back to Paris. I am very tired, and as I have not eaten so good a dinner as you, I can scarcely stand." The young man shuddered at this strange familiarity. "Tell me," he said, "tell me what you want." "Well then, I want you to take me up in your fine carriage and carry me back." Andrea turned pale, but said nothing. "Yes," said the man, thrusting his hands into his pockets and looking impudently at the youth. "I have taken the whim into my head. Do you understand, Master Benedetto?" At this name, no doubt, the young man reflected a little, for he went towards his groom, saying, "This man is right. I did indeed charge him with a commission, the result of which he must tell me. Walk to the barrier. There, take a cab, that you may not be too late." The surprised groom retired. "Let me at least reach a shady spot," said Andrea. "Oh, as for that, I'll take you to a splendid place," said the man with the handkerchief, and taking the horse's bit, he led the tilbury where it was certainly impossible for anyone to witness the honor that Andrea conferred upon him. "Don't think I want the glory of riding in your fine carriage," said he. "Oh no, it's only because I am tired, and also because I have a little business to talk over with you." "Come, step in," said the young man. It was a pity this scene had not occurred in daylight, for it was curious to see this rascal throwing himself heavily down on the cushion beside the young and elegant driver of the tilbury. Andrea drove past the last house in the village without saying a word to his companion, who smiled complacently, as though well pleased to find himself traveling in so comfortable a vehicle. Once out of Auteuil, Andrea looked around in order to assure himself that he could neither be seen nor heard, and then, stopping the horse and crossing his arms before the man, he asked, "Now, tell me why you have come to disturb my tranquillity." "Let me ask you why you deceived me." "How have I deceived you?" "How, do you ask? When we parted at the Pont du Var, you told me you were going to travel through Piedmont and Tuscany. But instead of that, you come to Paris." "How does that annoy you?" "It does not. On the contrary, I think it will answer my purpose." "So," said Andrea, "you are speculating upon me?" What fine words he uses! "I warn you, Master Caderousse, that you are mistaken." "Well, well, don't be angry, my boy. You know well enough what it is to be unfortunate, and misfortunes make us jealous. I thought you were earning a living in Tuscany or Piedmont by acting as Facchino or Cicerone, and I pitied you sincerely, as I would a child of my own. You know, I always did call you my child." "Come, come. What then?" "Patience, patience." "I am patient, but go on." "All at once I see you pass through the barrier with a groom, a tilbury, and fine new clothes. You must have discovered a mine, or else become a stockbroker." "So that, as you confess, you are jealous?" "No, I am pleased. So pleased that I wish to congratulate you, but I am not quite properly dressed. I chose my opportunity that I might not compromise you." "Yes, and a fine opportunity you have chosen," exclaimed Andrea. "You speak to me before my servant." "How can I help that, my boy? I speak to you when I can catch you. You have a quick horse, a light tilbury. You are naturally as slippery as an eel. If I had missed you tonight, I might not have had another chance." You see, I did not conceal myself.
You are lucky. I wish I could say as much, for I do conceal myself, and then I was afraid you would not recognize me. But you did, added Caderousse, with his unpleasant smile. It was very polite of you.
Come, said Andrea. What do you want?
You do not speak affectionately to me, Benedetto, my old friend. That is not right. Take care, or I may become troublesome.
This menace smothered the young man's passion. He urged the horse again into a trot. You should not speak so to an old friend like me, Caderousse, as you say just now. You are a native of Marseille. I am...
Do you know then now what you are?
No, but I was brought up in Corsica. You are old and obstinate. I am young and willful. Between people like us, threats are out of place. Everything should be amicably arranged. Is it my fault if fortune, which is frowned upon you, has been kind to me?
Fortune has been kind to you, then? Your tilbury, your groom, your clothes are not then hired? Good. So much the better, said Caderousse, his eyes sparkling with avarice.
Oh, you knew that well enough before speaking to me, said Andrea, becoming more and more excited. If I had been wearing a handkerchief like yours on my head, rags on my back, and worn-out shoes on my feet, you would not have known me.
You wrong me, my boy. Now I have found you. Nothing prevents my being as well-dressed as anyone, knowing, as I do, the goodness of your heart. If you have 2 coats, you will give me one of them. I used to divide my soup and beans with you when you were hungry.
True, said Andrea.
What an appetite you used to have. Is it as good now?
Oh, yes, replied Andrea, laughing.
How did you come to be dining with that prince whose house you have just left?
He is not a prince, simply a count.
A count? And a rich one too, eh?
Yes, but you had better not have anything to say to him, for he is not a very good-tempered gentleman.
Oh, be easy. I have no design upon your count, and you shall have him all to yourself. But,
said Caderousse, again smiling with the disagreeable expression he had before assumed,
you must pay for it. You understand.
Well, what do you want?
I think that with 100 francs a month,
well,
I could live...
Upon 100 francs?
Come, you understand me. But that with...
With?
With 150 francs.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, September 2006. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 70. The Ball. It was in the warmest days of July, when in due course of time the Saturday arrived upon which the ball was to take place at Monsieur de Morcerf's. It was 10 o'clock at night. The branches of the great trees in the garden of the Count's house stood out boldly against the azure canopy of heaven, which was studded with golden stars, but where the last fleeting clouds of a vanishing storm yet lingered. From the apartments on the ground floor might be heard the sound of music, with the whirl of the waltz and galop, while brilliant streams of light shone through the openings of the Venetian blinds. At this moment the garden was only occupied by about 10 servants, who had just received orders from their mistress to prepare the supper, the serenity of the weather continuing to increase. Until now it had been undecided whether the supper should take place in the dining-room or under a long tent erected on the lawn, but the beautiful blue sky, studded with stars, had settled the question in favor of the lawn. The gardens were illuminated with colored lanterns, according to the Italian custom, and as is usual in countries where the luxuries of the table, the rarest of all luxuries in their complete form, are well understood, the supper table was loaded with wax lights and flowers. At the time the Countess of Morcerf returned to the rooms, after giving her orders, many guests were arriving, more attracted by the charming hospitality of the Countess than by the distinguished position of the Count. For, owing to the good taste of Mercédès, one was sure of finding some devices at her entertainment worthy of describing, or even copying in case of need. Madame Danglars, in whom the events we have related had caused deep anxiety, had hesitated about going to Madame de Morcerf's, when during the morning her carriage happened to meet that of Villefort. The latter made a sign, and when the carriages had drawn close together, said, "You are going to Madame de Morcerf's, are you not?" "No," replied Madame Danglars, "I am too ill." "You are wrong," replied Villefort significantly. "It is important that you should be seen there." "Do you think so?" asked the Baroness. "I do." "In that case I will go." And the two carriages passed on towards their different destinations. Madame Danglars therefore came, not only beautiful in person, but radiant with splendor. She entered by one door, at the time when Mercédès appeared at the door. The Countess took Albert to meet Madame Danglars. He approached, paid her some well-merited compliments on her toilette, and offered his arm to conduct her to a seat. Albert looked around him. "You are looking for my daughter," said the Baroness, smiling. "I confess it," replied Albert. "Could you have been so cruel as not to bring her?" "Calm yourself. She has met Mademoiselle de Villefort, and has taken her arm. See, they are following us, both in white dresses, one with a bouquet of camellias, the other with one of myosotis. But tell me—" "Well, what do you wish to know?" "Will not the Count of Monte Cristo be here tonight?" 17! replied Albert. "What do you mean?" "I only mean that the Count seems the rage," replied the Viscount, smiling, "and that you are the 17th person that has asked me the same question. The Count is in fashion. I congratulate him upon it." "And have you replied to every one as you have to me?" "Ah, to be sure. I have not answered you." "Be satisfied. We shall have this lion. We are among the privileged ones." "Were you at the opera yesterday?" "No." "He was there." "Ah, indeed. And did the eccentric person commit any new originality?" "Can he be seen without doing so? Elssler was dancing the Diable Boiteux. The Greek princess was in ecstasies. After the cachucha, he placed a magnificent ring on the stem of a bouquet, and threw it to the charming danseuse, who, in the third act, to do honor to the gift, reappeared with it on her finger. And the Greek princess, will she be here?" "No, you will be deprived of that pleasure. Her position in the Count's establishment is not sufficiently understood." "Wait, leave me here, and go and speak to Madame de Villefort, who is trying to attract your attention." Albert bowed to Madame Danglars, and advanced towards Madame de Villefort, whose lips opened as he approached. "I wager anything," said Albert, interrupting her, "that I know what you are about to say." "Well, what is it?" "If I guess rightly, will you confess it?" "Yes." "On your honor?" "On my honor." "You were going to ask me if the Count of Monte Cristo had arrived, or was expected." "Not at all. It is not of him that I am now thinking. I was going to ask you if you had received any news of Monsieur Franz." "Yes, yesterday." "What did he tell you?" "That he was leaving at the same time as his letter." "Well, now then, the Count?" "The Count will come. Of that you may be satisfied." "You know that he has another name besides Monte Cristo?" No, I did not know it. Monte Cristo is the name of an island, and he has a family name. I never heard it. Well, then, I am better informed than you. His name is Zaccone. It is possible. He is a Maltese. That is also possible. The son of a ship owner. Really, you should relate all this aloud. You would have the greatest success. He served in India, discovered a mine in Thessaly, and comes to Paris to establish a mineral water cure at Auteuil. Well, I'm sure, said Morcerf, this is indeed news. Am I allowed to repeat it? Yes, but cautiously. Tell one thing at a time, and do not say I told you. Why so? Because it is a secret just discovered. By whom? The police. Then the news originated at the prefect's last night. Paris, you can understand, is astonished at the sight of such unusual splendor, and the police have made inquiries. Well, well, nothing more is wanting than to arrest the Count as a vagabond on the pretext of his being too rich. Indeed, that doubtless would have happened if his credentials had not been so favorable. Poor Count! And is he aware of the danger he has been in? I think not. Then it will be but charitable to inform him. When he arrives I will not fail to do so. Just then a handsome young man, with bright eyes, black hair, and glossy moustache, respectfully bowed to Madame de Villefort. Albert extended his hand. "Madame," said Albert, "allow me to present to you Monsieur Maximilien Morel, captain of Spahis, one of our best, and above all, of our bravest officers." "I have already had the pleasure of meeting this gentleman at Auteuil, at the house of the Count of Monte Cristo," replied Madame de Villefort, turning away with marked coldness of manner. This answer, and especially the tone in which it was uttered, chilled the heart of poor Morel. But a recompense was in store for him. Turning around, he saw near the door a beautiful fair face, whose large blue eyes were, without any marked expression, fixed upon him, while the bouquet of myosotis was gently raised to her lips. The salutation was so well understood that Morel, with the same expression in his eyes, placed the handkerchief to his mouth, and these two living statues, whose hearts beat so violently under their marble aspect, separated from each other by the whole length of the room, forgot themselves for a moment, or rather forgot the world in their mutual contemplation. They might have remained much longer lost in one another without anyone noticing their abstraction. The Count of Monte Cristo had just entered. We have already said that there was something in the Count which attracted universal attention wherever he appeared. It was not the coat, unexceptional in its cut, though simple and unornamented. It was not the plain white waistcoat. It was not the trousers that displayed the foot so perfectly formed. It was none of these things that attracted the attention. It was his pale complexion, his waving black hair, his calm and serene expression, his dark and melancholy eye, his mouth, chiseled with such marvelous delicacy, which so easily expressed such high disdain. These were what fixed the attention of all upon him. Many men might have been handsomer, but certainly there could be none whose appearance was more significant, if the expression may be used. Everything about the Count seemed to have its meaning, for the constant habit of thought which he had acquired had given an ease and vigor to the expression of his face, and even to the most trifling gesture scarcely to be understood. Yet the Parisian world is so strange that even all this might not have won attention had there not been connected with it a mysterious story gilded by an immense fortune. Meanwhile, he advanced through the assemblage of guests under a battery of curious glances towards Madame de Morcerf, who, standing before a mantelpiece ornamented with flowers, had seen his entrance in a looking-glass placed opposite the door, and was prepared to receive him. She turned towards him with a serene smile, just at the moment he was bowing to her. No doubt she fancied the Count would speak to her, while on his side the Count thought she was about to address him, but both remained silent, and after a mere bow, Monte Cristo directed his steps to Albert, who received him cordially. "Have you seen my mother?" asked Albert. "I have just had the pleasure," replied the Count, "but I have not seen your father. See, he is down there, talking politics with that little group of great geniuses." "Indeed," said Monte Cristo. "And so those gentlemen down there are men of great talent? I should not have guessed it. And for what kind of talent are they celebrated? You know there are different sorts." "That tall, harsh-looking man is very learned. He discovered in the neighborhood of Rome a kind of lizard with a vertebra, more than lizards usually have, and he immediately laid his discovery before the Institute. The thing was discussed for a long time, but finally decided in his favor. I can assure you that the vertebra made a great noise in the learned world, and the gentleman, who was only a knight of the Legion of Honor, was made an officer." "Come," said Monte Cristo, "this cross seems to me to be wisely awarded. I suppose, had he found another additional vertebra, they would have made him a commander?" "Very likely," said Albert. "And who can that person be who has taken it into his head to wrap himself up in a blue coat embroidered with green?" "Oh, that coat is not his own idea. It is the Republic's, which deputed David to devise a uniform for the academicians." "Indeed," said Monte Cristo. "So this gentleman is an academician?" "Within the last week he has been made one of the learned assembly." "And what is his especial talent?" "His talent? I believe he thrusts pins through the head of rabbits. He makes fowls eat madder, and punches the spinal marrow out of dogs with whalebone." "And he is made a member of the Academy of Sciences for this?" "No, of the French Academy. But what has the French Academy to do with all this?" "I was going to tell you. It seems—" "That his experiments have very considerably advanced the cause of science, doubtless." "No, that his style of writing is very good." "This must be very flattering to the feelings of the rabbits into whose heads he has thrust pins, to the fowls whose bones he has dyed red, and to the dogs whose spinal marrow he has punched out." Albert laughed. "And the other one?" demanded the Count. "That one?" "Yes, the third. The one in the dark blue coat?" "Yes." "He is a colleague of the Count, and one of the most active opponents to the idea of providing the Chamber of Peers with a uniform. He was very successful upon that question. He stood badly with the Liberal papers, but his noble opposition to the wishes of the court is now getting him into favor with the journalists. They talk of making him an ambassador." "And what are his claims to the peerage?" "He has composed 2 or 3 comic operas, written 4 or 5 articles in the Siècle, and voted 5 or 6 years on the ministerial side." "Bravo, Viscount," said Monte Cristo, smiling. "You are a delightful cicerone. And now you will do me a favor, will you not?" "What is it?" "Do not introduce me to any of these gentlemen, and should they wish it, you will warn me." Just then the Count felt his arm pressed. He turned round. It was Danglars. "Ah, is it you, Baron?" said he. "Why do you call me Baron?" said Danglars. "You know that I care nothing for my title. I am not like you, Viscount. You like your title, do you not?" "Certainly," replied Albert, "seeing that without my title I should be nothing, while you, sacrificing the Baron, would still remain the millionaire." "Which seems to me the finest title under the royalty of July," replied Danglars. "Unfortunately," said Monte Cristo, "one's title to a millionaire does not last for life. Like that of Baron, peer of France, or academician, for example the millionaires Frank and Poulman, of Frankfurt, who have just become bankrupts." "Indeed?" said Danglars, becoming pale. "Yes, I received the news this evening by courier. I had about 1 million in their hands, but, warned in time, I withdrew it a month ago." "Ah, mon Dieu!" exclaimed Danglars. They have drawn on me for 200,000 francs. Well, you can throw out the draft. Their signature is worth 5%. Yes, but it is too late, said Danglars. I have honored their bills. Then, said Monte Cristo, here are 200,000 francs gone after. Hush! Do not mention these things, said Danglars. Then, approaching Monte Cristo, he added, especially before young Monsieur Cavalcanti. After which he smiled, and turned towards the young man in question. Albert had left the count to speak to his mother, Danglars to converse with young Cavalcanti. Monte Cristo was for an instant alone. Meanwhile, the heat became excessive. Footmen were hastening through the rooms with waiters loaded with ices. Monte Cristo wiped the perspiration from his forehead, but drew back when the waiter was presented to him. He took no refreshment. Madame de Morcerf did not lose sight of Monte Cristo. She saw that he took nothing, and even noticed his gesture of refusal. "Albert," she asked, "did you notice that?" "What, mother?" "That the count has never been willing to partake of food under the roof of Monsieur de Morcerf." "Yes, but then he breakfasted with me. Indeed, he made his first appearance in the world on that occasion." "But your house is not Monsieur de Morcerf's," murmured Mercédès, "and since he has been here, I have watched him." "Well?" "Well, he has taken nothing yet. The count is very temperate." Mercédès smiled sadly. "Approach him," said she, "and when the next waiter passes, insist upon his taking something." "But why, mother?" "Just to please me, Albert," said Mercédès. Albert kissed his mother's hand and drew near the count. Another salver passed, loaded like the preceding ones. She saw Albert attempt to persuade the count, but he obstinately refused. Albert rejoined his mother. She was very pale. "Well," said she, "you see he refuses." "Yes, but why need this annoy you?" "You know, Albert, women are singular creatures. I should like to have seen the count take something in my house, if only an ice. Perhaps he cannot reconcile himself to the French style of living, and might prefer something else." "Oh, no, I have seen him eat of everything in Italy. No doubt he does not feel inclined this evening." "And besides," said the countess, "accustomed as he is to burning climates, possibly he does not feel the heat as we do." "I do not think that, for he has complained of feeling almost suffocated, and asked why the Venetian blinds were not opened, as well as the windows." "In a word," said Mercédès, "it was a way of assuring me that his abstinence was intended." And she left the room. A minute afterwards the blinds were thrown open, and through the jessamine and clematis that overhung the window one could see the garden ornamented with lanterns, and the supper laid under the tent. Dancers, players, talkers, all uttered an exclamation of joy. Everyone inhaled with delight the breeze that floated in. At the same time Mercédès reappeared, paler than before, but with that imperturbable expression of countenance which she sometimes wore. She went straight to the group of which her husband formed the center. "Do not detain those gentlemen here, Count," she said. "They would prefer, I should think, to breathe in the garden rather than suffocate here, since they are not playing." "Ah," said a gallant old general, who in 1809 had sung Partant pour la Syrie, "we will not go alone to the garden." "Then," said Mercédès, "I will lead the way." Turning towards Monte Cristo, she added, "Count, will you oblige me with your arm?" The count almost staggered at these simple words. Then he fixed his eyes on Mercédès. It was only a momentary glance, but it seemed to the countess to have lasted for a century. So much was expressed in that one look. He offered his arm to the countess. She took it, or rather just touched it with her little hand, and they together descended the steps, lined with rhododendrons and camellias. Behind them, by another outlet, a group of about 20 persons rushed into the garden with loud exclamations of delight. End of chapter 70.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Chris the Girl. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 71. Bread and Salt. Madame de Morcerf entered an archway of trees with her companion. It led through a grove of lindens to a conservatory. "It was too warm in the room, was it not, Count?" she asked. "Yes, madame, and it was an excellent idea of yours to open the doors and the blinds." As he ceased speaking, the Count felt the hand of Mercedes tremble. "But you," he said, "with that light dress and without anything to cover you but that gauze scarf, perhaps you feel cold?" "Do you know where I am leading you?" said the Countess, without replying to the question. "No, madame," replied Monte Cristo, "but you see I make no resistance." "We are going to the greenhouse that you see at the other end of the grove." The Count looked at Mercedes, as if to interrogate her, but she continued to walk on in silence, and he refrained from speaking. They reached the building, ornamented with magnificent fruits, which ripen at the beginning of July in the artificial temperature which takes the place of the sun, so frequently absent in our climate. The Countess left the arm of Monte Cristo and gathered a bunch of muscatel grapes. "See, Count," she said, with a smile so sad in its expression that one could almost detect the tears on her eyelids. "See, our French grapes are not to be compared, I know, with yours of Sicily and Cyprus. But you will make allowance for our northern sun?" The Count bowed, but stepped back. "Do you refuse?" said Mercedes in a tremulous voice. "Pray excuse me, madame," replied Monte Cristo, "but I never eat muscatel grapes." Mercedes let them fall, and sighed. A magnificent peach was hanging against an adjoining wall, ripened by the same artificial heat. Mercedes drew near and plucked the fruit. "Take this peach, then," she said. The Count again refused. "What, again?" she exclaimed, in so plaintive an accent that it seemed to stifle a sob. "Really, you pain me." A long silence followed. The peach, like the grapes, fell to the ground. "Count," added Mercedes with a supplicating glance, "there is a beautiful Arabian custom which makes eternal friends of those who have together eaten bread and salt under the same roof." "I know it, madame," replied the Count, "but we are in France and not in Arabia, and in France eternal friendships are as rare as the custom of dividing bread and salt with one another." "But," said the Countess breathlessly, with her eyes fixed on Monte Cristo, whose arm she convulsively pressed with both hands, "we are friends, are we not?" The Count became pale as death, the blood rushed to his heart, and then again, rising, dyed his cheeks with crimson. His eyes swam like those of a man suddenly dazzled. "Certainly we are friends," he replied. "Why should we not be?" The answer was so little like the one Mercedes desired that she turned away to give vent to a sigh, which sounded more like a groan. "Thank you," she said, and they walked on again. They went the whole length of the garden without uttering a word. "Sir," suddenly exclaimed the Countess, after their walk had continued 10 minutes in silence, "is it true that you have seen so much, traveled so far, and suffered so deeply?" "I have suffered deeply, madame," answered Monte Cristo. "But now you are happy?" "Doubtless," replied the Count, "since no one hears me complain." "And your present happiness, has it softened your heart?" "My present happiness equals my past misery," said the Count. "Are you not married?" asked the Countess. "I married?" exclaimed Monte Cristo, shuddering. "Who could have told you so?" "No one told me you were, but you have frequently been seen at the opera with a young and lovely woman." "She is a slave, whom I bought at Constantinople, madame, the daughter of a prince. I have adopted her as my daughter, having no one else to love in the world." "You live alone, then?" "I do." "You have no sister, no son, no father?" "I have no one." "How can you exist thus without anyone to attach you to life?" "It is not my fault, madame. At Malta I loved a young girl, was on the point of marrying her, when war came and carried me away. I thought she loved me well enough to wait for me, and even to remain faithful to my memory. When I returned, she was married. This is the history of most men who have passed 20 years of age. Perhaps my heart was weaker than the hearts of most men, and I suffered more than they would have done in my place. That is all. The Countess stopped for a moment, as if gasping for breath. Yes, she said, and you have still preserved this love in your heart. One can only love once. And did you ever see her again? Never. Never? I never returned to the country where she lived. To Malta? Yes, Malta. She is, then, now at Malta? I think so. And have you forgiven her for all she has made you suffer? Her, yes. But only her. Do you then still hate those who separated you? I hate them? Not at all. Why should I? The Countess placed herself before Monte Cristo, still holding in her hand a portion of the perfumed grapes. Take some, she said. Madame, I never eat muscatel grapes, replied Monte Cristo, as if the subject had not been mentioned before. The Countess dashed the grapes into the nearest thicket, with a gesture of despair. Inflexible man, she murmured. Monte Cristo remained as unmoved as if the reproach had not been addressed to him. Albert at this moment ran in. "Oh, mother!" he exclaimed. "Such a misfortune has happened!" "What? What has happened?" asked the Countess, as though awakening from a sleep to the realities of life. "Did you say a misfortune? Indeed, I should expect misfortunes." "Monsieur de Villefort is here." "Well?" "He comes to fetch his wife and daughter." "Why so?" "Because Madame de Saint-Méran is just arrived in Paris, bringing the news of Monsieur de Saint-Méran's death, which took place on the first stage after he left Marseille. Madame de Villefort, who is in very good spirits, would neither believe nor think of the misfortune, but Mademoiselle Valentine, at the first words, guessed the whole truth, notwithstanding all the precautions of her father. The blow struck her like a thunderbolt, and she fell senseless." "And how was Monsieur de Saint-Méran related to Mademoiselle de Villefort?" said the Count. "He was her grandfather on the mother's side. He was coming here to hasten her marriage with Franz." "Ah, indeed." "So Franz must wait." "Why was not Monsieur de Saint-Méran also grandfather to Mademoiselle Danglars?" "Albert, Albert," said Madame de Morcerf, in a tone of mild reproof, "what are you saying?" "Ah, Count, he esteems you so highly. Tell him that he has spoken amiss." And she took 2 or 3 steps forward. Monte Cristo watched her with an air so thoughtful and so full of affectionate admiration that she turned back and grasped his hand. At the same time, she seized that of her son and joined them together. "We are friends, are we not?" she asked. "Oh, madame, I do not presume to call myself your friend, but at all times I am your most respectful servant." The Countess left with an indescribable pang in her heart, and before she had taken 10 steps, the Count saw her raise her handkerchief to her eyes. "Do not my mother and you agree?" asked Albert, astonished. "On the contrary," replied the Count. "Did you not hear her declare that we were friends?" They re-entered the drawing-room, which Valentine and Madame de Villefort had just quitted. It is perhaps needless to add that Morrel departed almost at the same time. End of chapter 71.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Joe Burbidge from London, UK, in October 2006. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 72. Madame de Saint-Méran. A gloomy scene had indeed just passed at the house of Monsieur de Villefort. After the ladies had departed for the ball, whither all the entreaties of Madame de Villefort had failed in persuading him to accompany them, the procureur had shut himself up in his study, according to his custom, with a heap of papers calculated to alarm anyone else, but which generally scarcely satisfied his inordinate desires. But this time the papers were a mere matter of form. Villefort had secluded himself, not to study, but to reflect, and with the door locked and orders given that he should not be disturbed excepting for important business, he sat down in his armchair and began to ponder over the events, the remembrance of which had, during the last 8 days, filled his mind with so many gloomy thoughts and bitter recollections. Then, instead of plunging into the mass of documents piled before him, he opened the drawer of his desk, touched a spring, and drew out a parcel of cherished memoranda, amongst which he had carefully arranged, in characters only known to himself, the names of all those who, either in his political career, in money matters, at the bar, or in his mysterious love affairs, had become his enemies. Their number was formidable, now that he had begun to fear, and yet these names, powerful though they were, had often caused him to smile with the same kind of satisfaction experienced by a traveller who, from the summit of a mountain, beholds at his feet the craggy eminences, the almost impassable paths, and the fearful chasms through which he has so perilously climbed. When he had run over all these names in his memory, again read and studied them, commenting meanwhile upon his lists, he shook his head. "No," he murmured, "none of my enemies would have waited so patiently and laboriously for so long a space of time that they might now come and crush me with this secret. Sometimes, as Hamlet says, foul deeds will rise, though all the earth overwhelm them to men's eyes. But, like a phosphoric light, they rise but to mislead. The story has been told by the Corsican to some priest, who, in his turn, has repeated it. Monsieur de Monte Cristo may have heard it, and, to enlighten himself— But why should he wish to enlighten himself upon the subject? Asked Villefort, after a moment's reflection. What interest can this Monsieur de Monte Cristo, or Monsieur Zaccone, son of a shipowner of Malta, discoverer of a mine in Thessaly, now visiting Paris for the first time, what interest, I say, can he take in discovering a gloomy, mysterious, and useless fact like this? However, among all the incoherent details given to me by the Abbé Bussini and by Lord Wilmore, by that friend and that enemy, one thing appears certain and clear in my opinion, that in no period, in no case, in no circumstance, could there have been any contact between him and me. But Villefort uttered words which even he himself did not believe. He dreaded not so much the revelation, for he could reply to or deny its truth. He cared little for that Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, which appeared suddenly in letters of blood upon the wall. But what he was really anxious for was to discover whose hand had traced them. While he was endeavouring to calm his fears, and instead of dwelling upon the political future that had so often been the subject of his ambitious dreams, was imagining a future limited to the enjoyments of home, in fear of awakening the enemy that had so long slept, the noise of a carriage sounded in the yard. Then he heard the steps of an aged person ascending the stairs, followed by tears and lamentations, such as servants always give vent to when they wish to appear interested in their master's grief. He drew back the bolt of his door, and almost directly an old lady entered, unannounced, carrying her shawl on her arm, and her bonnet in her hand. The white hair was thrown back from her yellow forehead, and her eyes, already sunken by the furrows of age, now almost disappeared beneath the eyelids, swollen with grief. "Oh, sir," she said, "oh, sir, what a misfortune! I shall die of it. Oh, yes, I shall certainly die of it." And then, falling upon the chair nearest the door, she burst into a paroxysm of sobs. The servants, standing in the doorway, not daring to approach nearer, were looking at Noirtier's old servant, who had heard the noise from his master's room, and run there also, remaining behind the others. Villefort rose, and ran towards his mother-in-law, for it was she. "Why, what can have happened?" he exclaimed. "What has thus disturbed you? Is Monsieur de Saint-Méran with you?" "Monsieur de Saint-Méran is dead," answered the old Marchioness. Without preface and without expression, she appeared to be stupefied. Villefort drew back, and clasping his hands together, exclaimed, "Dead? So suddenly?" "A week ago," continued Madame de Saint-Méran, "we went out together in the carriage after dinner. Monsieur de Saint-Méran had been unwell for some days. Still, the idea of seeing our dear Valentine again inspired him with courage, and notwithstanding his illness, he would leave. At 6 leagues from Marseille, after having eaten some of the lozenges he is accustomed to take, he fell into such a deep sleep that it appeared to me unnatural. Still, I hesitated to wake him, although I fancied that his face was flushed, and that the veins of his temples throbbed more violently than usual. However, as it became dark, and I could no longer see, I fell asleep. I was soon aroused by a piercing shriek, as from a person suffering in his dreams, and he suddenly threw his head back violently. I called the valet, I stopped the postilion, I spoke to Monsieur de Saint-Méran, I applied my smelling salts, but all was over, and I arrived at Aix by the side of a corpse." Villefort stood with his mouth half open, quite stupefied. "Of course, you sent for a doctor?" "Immediately, but, as I have told you, it was too late." "Yes, but then he could tell of what complaint the poor Marquise had died." "Oh, yes, sir, he told me. It appears to have been an apoplectic stroke." "And what did you do then?" Monsieur de Saint-Méran had always expressed a desire, in case his death happened during his absence from Paris, that his body might be brought to the family vault. I had him put into a lead coffin, and I am preceding him by a few days." "Oh, my poor mother," said Villefort, "to have such duties to perform at your age, after such a blow. God has supported me through all. And then, my dear Marquise, he would certainly have done everything for me that I performed for him. It is true that since I left him, I seem to have lost my senses. I cannot cry. At my age, they say that we have no more tears. Still, I think that when one is in trouble, one should have the power of weeping. Where is Valentine, sir? It is on her account I am here. I wish to see Valentine." Villefort thought it would be terrible to reply that Valentine was at a ball, so he only said that she had gone out with her stepmother, and that she should be fetched. "This instant, sir, this instant, I beseech you," said the old lady. Villefort placed the arm of Madame de Saint-Méran within his own, and conducted her to his apartment. "Rest yourself, mother," he said. The Marchioness raised her head at this word, and beholding the man who so forcibly reminded her of her deeply regretted child, who still lived for her in Valentine, she felt touched at the name of her mother, and, bursting into tears, she fell on her knees before an armchair, where she buried her venerable head. Villefort left her to the care of the women, while old Barrois ran, half scared, to his master. For nothing frightens old people so much as when death relaxes its vigilance over them for a moment, in order to strike some other old person. Then, while Madame de Saint-Méran remained on her knees, praying fervently, Villefort sent for a cab, and went himself to fetch his wife and daughter from Madame de Morcerf's. He was so pale when he appeared at the door of the ballroom, that Valentine ran to him, saying, "Oh, father, some misfortune has happened." "Your grandmamma has just arrived, Valentine," said Monsieur de Villefort. "And grandpapa?" inquired the young girl, trembling with apprehension. Monsieur de Villefort only replied by offering his arm to his daughter. It was just in time, for Valentine's head swam, and she staggered. Madame de Villefort instantly hastened to her assistance, and aided her husband in dragging her to the carriage, saying, "What a singular event! Who could have thought it? Ah, yes, it is indeed strange." And the wretched family departed, leaving a cloud of sadness hanging over the rest of the evening. At the foot of the stairs, Valentine found Barrois awaiting her. "Monsieur Noirtier wishes to see you tonight," he said, in an undertone. "Tell him I will come when I leave my dear grandmamma," she replied, feeling, with true delicacy, that the person to whom she could be of the most service just then was Madame de Saint-Méran. Valentine found her grandmother in bed. Silent caresses, heart-wrung sobs, broken sighs, burning tears were all that passed in this sad interview, while Madame de Villefort, leaning on her husband's arm, maintained all outward forms of respect, at least towards the poor widow. She soon whispered to her husband, "I think it would be better for me to retire, with your permission, for the sight of me appears still to afflict your mother-in-law." Madame de Saint-Méran heard her. Yes, yes," she said softly to Valentine. "Let her leave, but do you stay." Madame de Villefort left, and Valentine remained alone beside the bed, for the procureur, overcome with astonishment at the unexpected death, had followed his wife. Meanwhile, Barrois had returned for the first time to old Noirtier, who, having heard the noise in the house, had, as we have said, sent his old servant to inquire the cause. On his return, his quick, intelligent eye interrogated the messenger. "Alas, sir," exclaimed Barrois, "a great misfortune has happened. Madame de Saint-Méran has arrived, and her husband is dead." Madame de Saint-Méran and Noirtier had never been on strict terms of friendship. Still, the death of one old man always considerably affects another. Noirtier let his head fall upon his chest, apparently overwhelmed and thoughtful. Then he closed one eye, in token of inquiry. "Mademoiselle Valentine?" Noirtier nodded his head. "She is at the ball, as you know, since she came to say good-bye to you in full dress." Noirtier again closed his left eye. "Do you wish to see her?" Noirtier again made an affirmative sign. "Well, they have gone to fetch her, no doubt, from Madame de Morcerf's. I will await her return, and beg her to come up here. Is that what you wish for?" "Yes," replied the invalid. Barrois, therefore, as we have seen, watched for Valentine, and informed her of her grandfather's wish. Consequently, Valentine came up to Noirtier, on leaving Madame de Saint-Méran, who, in the midst of her grief, had at last yielded to fatigue, and fallen into a feverish sleep. Within reach of her hand they placed a small table, upon which stood a bottle of orangeade, her usual beverage, and a glass. Then, as we have said, the young girl left the bedside to see Monsieur Noirtier. Valentine kissed the old man, who looked at her with such tenderness that her eyes again filled with tears, whose sources he thought must be exhausted. The old gentleman continued to dwell upon her with the same expression. "Yes, yes," said Valentine. "You mean that I have yet a kind grandfather left, do you not?" The old man intimated that such was his meaning. "Ah, yes, happily I have," replied Valentine. "Without that, what would become of me?" It was 1 o'clock in the morning. Barrois, who wished to go to bed himself, observed that after such sad events everyone stood in need of rest. Noirtier would not say that the only rest he needed was to see his child, but wished her good night, for grief and fatigue had made her appear quite ill. The next morning she found her grandmother in bed. The fever had not abated. On the contrary, her eyes glistened, and she appeared to be suffering from violent nervous irritability. "Oh, dear grandmother, are you worse?" exclaimed Valentine, perceiving all these signs of agitation. "No, my child, no," said Madame de Saint-Méran. "But I was impatiently waiting for your arrival, that I might send for your father." "My father?" inquired Valentine uneasily. "Yes, I wish to speak to him." Valentine durst not oppose her grandmother's wish, the cause of which she did not know, and an instant afterwards Villefort entered. "Sir," said Madame de Saint-Méran, without using any circumlocution, and as if fearing she had no time to lose, you wrote to me concerning the marriage of this child?" "Yes, madame," replied Villefort. "It is not only projected, but arranged. Your intended son-in-law is named Monsieur Franz d'Épinay?" "Yes, madame." "Is he not the son of General d'Épinay, who was on our side, and who was assassinated some days before the usurper returned from the island of Elba?" "The same." "Does he not dislike the idea of marrying the granddaughter of a Jacobin?" "Our civil dissensions are now happily extinguished, mother," said Villefort. "Monsieur d'Épinay was quite a child when his father died. He knows very little of Monsieur Noirtier, and will meet him, if not with pleasure, at least with indifference." "Is it a suitable match?" "In every respect." "And the young man?" "Is regarded with universal esteem." "You approve of him?" "He's one of the most well-bred young men I know." During the whole of this conversation, Valentine had remained silent. "Well, sir," said Madame de Saint-Méran, after a few minutes' reflection, "I must hasten the marriage, for I have but a short time to live." "You, madame? You, dear mamma?" exclaimed Monsieur de Villefort and Valentine at the same time. "I know what I am saying," continued the Marchioness. "I must hurry you, so that, as she has no mother, she may at least have a grandmother to bless her marriage. I am all that is left to her belonging to my poor Renée, whom you have so soon forgotten, sir." "Ah, madame," said Villefort, "you forget that I was obliged to give a mother to my child." "A stepmother is never a mother, sir. But this is not to the purpose. Our business concerns Valentine. Let us leave the dead in peace." All this was said with such exceeding rapidity that there was something in the conversation that seemed like the beginning of delirium. "It shall be as you wish, madame," said Villefort, "more especially since your wishes coincide with mine, and as soon as Monsieur d'Épinay arrives in Paris—" "My dear grandmother," interrupted Valentine, "consider decorum, the recent death. You would not have me marry under such sad auspices." "My child," exclaimed the old lady sharply, "let us hear none of the conventional objections that deter weak minds from preparing for the future. I also was married at the deathbed of my mother, and certainly I have not been less happy on that account." "Still, that idea of death, madame," said Villefort. "Still?" "Always. I tell you I am going to die. Do you understand? Well, before dying, I wish to see my son-in-law. I wish to tell him to make my child happy. I wish to read in his eyes whether he intends to obey me. In fact, I will know him. I will," continued the old lady, with a fearful expression, "that I may rise from the depths of my grave to find him, if he should not fulfill his duty." "Madame," said Villefort, "you must lay aside these exalted ideas, which almost assume the appearance of madness. The dead, once buried in their graves, rise no more. And I tell you, sir, that you are mistaken. This night I have had a fearful sleep. It seemed as though my soul were already hovering over my body. My eyes, which I tried to open, closed against my will, and what will appear impossible, above all to you, sir, I saw, with my eyes shut, in the spot where you are now standing, issuing from that corner where there is a door leading into Madame Villefort's dressing room. I saw, I tell you, silently enter a white figure." Valentine screamed. "It was the fever that disturbed you, madame," said Villefort. "Doubt, if you please, but I am sure of what I say. I saw a white figure, and as if to prevent my discrediting the testimony of only one of my senses, I heard my glass removed, the same which is there now on the table. Oh, dear mother, it was a dream. So little was it a dream that I stretched my hand towards the bell, but when I did so, the shade disappeared. My maid then entered with a light. But she saw no one. Phantoms are visible to those only who ought to see them. It was the soul of my husband. Well, if my husband's soul can come to me, Why should not my soul reappear to guard my granddaughter? The tie is even more direct, it seems to me. Oh, madame, said Villefort, deeply affected, in spite of himself, do not yield to those gloomy thoughts. You will long live with us, happy, loved, and honoured, and we will make you forget. Never, 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 said the Marchioness. When does Mr. Epinay return? We expect him every moment. It is well. As soon as he arrives, inform me. We must be expeditious, and then I also wish to see a notary, that I may be assured that all our property returns to Valentine. Ah, Grandma, murmured Valentine, pressing her lips on the burning brow. Do you wish to kill me? Oh, how feverish you are. We must not send for a notary, but for a doctor. A doctor? Said she, shrugging her shoulders. I am not ill. I am thirsty, that is all. What are you drinking, dear Grandmamma? The same as usual, my dear. My glass is there on the table. Give it to me, Valentine. Valentine poured the orangeade into a glass and gave it to her grandmother with a certain degree of dread, for it was the same glass she fancied that had been touched by the spectre. The Marchioness drained the glass at a single draught, and then turned on her pillow, repeating, "The notary! The notary!" Monsieur de Villefort left the room, and Valentine seated herself at the bedside of her grandmother. The poor child appeared herself to require the doctor she had recommended to her aged relative. A bright spot burned in either cheek. Her respiration was short and difficult, and her pulse beat with feverish excitement. She was thinking of the despair of Maximilian, when he should be informed that Madame de Saint-Méran, instead of being an ally, was unconsciously acting as his enemy. More than once she thought of revealing all to her grandmother, and she would not have hesitated a moment if Maximilian Morel had been named Albert de Morcerf or Raoul de Chateau Renaud. But Morel was of plebeian extraction, and Valentine knew how the haughty Marquis de Saint-Méran despised all who were not noble. Her secret had each time been repressed, when she was about to reveal it, by the sad conviction that it would be useless to do so, for, were it once discovered by her father and mother, all would be lost. 2 hours passed thus. Madame de Saint-Méran was in a feverish sleep, and the notary had arrived. Though his coming was announced in a very low tone, Madame de Saint-Méran arose from her pillow. "The notary!" she exclaimed. "Let him come in." The notary, who was at the door, immediately entered. "Go, Valentine," said Madame de Saint-Méran, "and leave me with this gentleman." "But, Grandmamma—" "Leave me, go." The young girl kissed her grandmother, and left with her handkerchief to her eyes. At the door she found the valet de chambre, who told her that the doctor was waiting in the dining-room. Valentine instantly ran down. The doctor was a friend of the family, and at the same time one of the cleverest men of the day, and very fond of Valentine, whose birth he had witnessed. He had himself a daughter about her age, but whose life was one continued source of anxiety and fear to him, from her mother having been consumptive. "Oh," said Valentine, "we have been waiting for you with such impatience, dear Mr. Avrigny. But, first of all, how are Madeleine and Antoinette?" Madeleine was the daughter of Monsieur d'Avrigny, and Antoinette his niece. Monsieur d'Avrigny smiled sadly. "Antoinette is very well," he said, "and Madeleine tolerably so. But you sent for me, my dear child. It is not your father or Madame de Villefort who is ill. As for you, although we doctors cannot divest our patients of nerves, I fancy you have no further need of me than to recommend you not to allow your imagination to take too wide a field." Valentine coloured. Monsieur d'Avrigny carried the science of divination almost to a miraculous extent, for he was one of the physicians who always work upon the body through the mind. "No," she replied, "it is for my poor grandmother. You know the calamity that has happened to us, do you not?" "I know nothing," said Monsieur d'Avrigny. Alas, said Valentine, restraining her tears, my grandfather is dead. Monsieur de Saint-Méran? Yes. Suddenly? From an apoplectic stroke. An apoplectic stroke? Repeated the doctor. Yes, and my poor grandmother fancies that her husband, whom she never left, has called her, and that she must go and join him. Oh, Monsieur d'Avrigny, I beseech you, do something for her. Where is she? In her room with the notary. And Monsieur Noirtier? Just as he was, his mind perfectly clear, but the same incapability of moving or speaking. And the same love for you, eh, my dear child? Yes, said Valentine, he was very fond of me. Who does not love you? Valentine smiled sadly. What are your grandmother's symptoms? An extreme nervous excitement and a strangely agitated sleep. She fancied this morning in her sleep that her soul was hovering above her body, which she at the same time watched. It must have been delirium, she fancies too, that she saw a phantom enter her chamber, and even heard the noise it made on touching her glass. It is singular, said the doctor. I was not aware that Madame de Saint-Méran was subject to such hallucinations. It is the first time I ever saw her in this condition, said Valentine, and this morning she frightened me so that I thought her mad. And my father, who you know is a strong-minded man, himself appeared deeply impressed. We will go and see, said the doctor. What you tell me seems very strange. The notary here descended, and Valentine was informed that her grandmother was alone. Go upstairs, she said to the doctor. And you? Oh, I dare not. She forbade my sending for you, and, as you say, I am myself agitated, feverish, and out of sorts. I will go and take a turn in the garden to recover myself. The doctor pressed Valentine's hand, and while he visited her grandmother, she descended the steps. We need not say which portion of the garden was her favourite walk. After remaining for a short time in the parterre surrounding the house, and gathering a rose to place in her waist or hair, she turned into the dark avenue which led to the bench. Then, from the bench, she went to the gate. As usual, Valentine strolled for a short time among her flowers, but without gathering them. The mourning in her heart forbade her assuming the simple ornament, though she had not yet had time to put on the outward semblance of woe. She then turned towards the avenue. As she advanced, she fancied she heard a voice speaking her name. She stopped astonished. Then the voice reached her ear more distinctly, and she recognized it to be that of Maximilian. End of chapter 72.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie Bynum. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. Chapter 73, Part 1. The Promise. It was indeed Maximilian Morrel who had passed a wretched existence since the previous day. With the instinct peculiar to lovers, he had anticipated after the return of Madame de Saint-Méran and the death of the Marquis that something would occur at Monsieur de Villefort's in connection with his attachment for Valentine. His presentiments were realized, as we shall see, and his uneasy forebodings had goaded him pale and trembling to the gate under the chestnut trees. Valentine was ignorant of the cause of this sorrow and anxiety, and as it was not his accustomed hour for visiting her, she had gone to the spot simply by accident, or perhaps through sympathy. Morrel called her, and she ran to the gate. "You are here at this hour?" said she. "Yes, my poor girl," replied Morrel. "I come to bring and to hear bad tidings." "This is indeed a house of mourning," said Valentine. "Speak, Maximilian, although the cup of sorrow seems already full." "Dear Valentine," said Morrel, endeavoring to conceal his own emotion, "listen, I entreat you." What I am about to say is very serious. When are you to be married?" "I will tell you all," said Valentine. "From you I have nothing to conceal. This morning the subject was introduced, and my dear grandmother, on whom I depended as my only support, not only declared herself favorable to it, but is so anxious for it that they only await the arrival of Monsieur d'Épinay. And the following day the contract will be signed." A deep sigh escaped the young man, who gazed long and mournfully at her he loved. "Alas!" replied he, "it is dreadful thus to hear my condemnation from your own lips. The sentence is passed, and in a few hours will be executed. It must be so, and I will not endeavor to prevent it. But since you say nothing remains but for Monsieur d'Épinay to arrive that the contract may be signed, and the following day you will be his, tomorrow you will be engaged to Monsieur d'Épinay, for he came this morning to Paris." Valentine uttered a cry. "I was at the house of Monte Cristo an hour since," said Morrel. "We were speaking, he of the sorrow your family had experienced, and I of your grief, when a carriage rolled into the courtyard. Never till then had I placed any confidence in presentiments, but now I cannot help believing them, Valentine. At the sound of that carriage I shuddered. Soon I heard steps on the staircase, which terrified me as much as the footsteps of the commander did Don Juan. The door at last opened. Albert de Morcerf entered, and I began to hope my fears were vain, when after him another young man advanced, and the Count exclaimed, 'Ah, here is the Baron Franz d'Épinay!' I summoned all my strength and courage to my support. Perhaps I turned pale and trembled, but certainly I smiled, and 5 minutes after I left, without having heard one word that had passed." "Poor Maximilian!" murmured Valentine. "Valentine, the time has arrived that you must answer me. And remember, my life depends on your answer. What do you intend doing?" Valentine held down her head; she was overwhelmed. "Listen," said Morrel. "It is not the first time you have contemplated our present position, which is a serious and urgent one. I do not think it is a moment to give way to useless sorrow. Leave that for those who like to suffer at their leisure and indulge their grief in secret. There are such in the world, and God will doubtless reward them in heaven for their resignation on earth, but those who mean to contend must not lose one precious moment, but must return immediately the blow which fortune strikes. Do you intend to struggle against our ill fortune? Tell me, Valentine, for it is that I came to know." Valentine trembled and looked at him with amazement. The idea of resisting her father, her grandmother, and all the family had never occurred to her. "What do you say, Maximilian?" asked Valentine. "What do you mean by a struggle? Oh, it would be sacrilege! What? I resist my father's order and my dying grandmother's wish? Impossible!" Morrel started. "You are too noble not to understand me, and yet you understand me so well that you already yield, dear Maximilian. No, no, I shall need all my strength to struggle with myself and support my grief in secret, as you say, but to grieve my father, to disturb my grandmother's last moments, never." "You are right," said Morrel calmly. "In what a tone you speak!" cried Valentine. "I speak as one who admires you, mademoiselle." "Mademoiselle!" cried Valentine. "Mademoiselle! Oh, selfish man! He sees me in despair and pretends he cannot understand me. You mistake. I understand you perfectly. You will not oppose Monsieur Villefort. You will not displease the Marchioness, and tomorrow you will sign the contract which will bind you to your husband. But, mon Dieu, tell me, how can I do otherwise? Do not appeal to me, mademoiselle. I shall be a bad judge in such a case. My selfishness will blind me," replied Morrel, whose low voice and clenched hands announced his growing desperation. "What would you have proposed, Maximilian, had you found me willing to accede?" "It is not for me to say." "You are wrong. You must advise me what to do." "Do you seriously ask my advice, Valentine?" "Certainly, dear Maximilian, for if it is good, I will follow it. You know my devotion to you." "Valentine," said Morrel, pushing aside a loose plank, "give me your hand in token of forgiveness of my anger. My senses are confused, and during the last hour the most extravagant thoughts have passed through my brain. Oh, if you refuse my advice!" "What do you advise?" said Valentine, raising her eyes to heaven and sighing. "I am free," replied Maximilian, "and rich enough to support you. I swear to make you my lawful wife before my lips even shall have approached your forehead." "You make me tremble," said the young girl. "Follow me," said Morel. "I will take you to my sister, who is worthy also to be yours. We will embark for Algiers, for England, for America, or, if you prefer it, retire to the country, and only return to Paris when our friends have reconciled your family." Valentine shook her head. "I feared it, Maximilian," she said. "It is the counsel of a madman, and I should be more mad than you did I not stop you at once with the word impossible, impossible." "You will then submit to what fate decrees for you without even attempting to contend with it?" said Morel sorrowfully. "Yes, if I die." "Well, Valentine," resumed Maximilian, "I can only say again that you are right. Truly it is I who am mad, and you prove to me that passion blinds the most well-meaning. I appreciate your calm reasoning. It is then understood that tomorrow you will be irrevocably promised to Monsieur Franz d'Épinay, not only by that theatrical formality invented to heighten the effect of a comedy called the signature of the contract, but your own will?" "Again you drive me to despair, Maximilian," said Valentine. "Again you plunge the dagger into the wound. What would you do, tell me, if your sister listened to such a proposition?" "Mademoiselle," replied Morel, with a bitter smile, "I am selfish. You have already said so, and as a selfish man I think not of what others would do in my situation, but of what I intend doing myself. I think only that I have known you not a whole year. From the first day I saw you, all my hopes of happiness have been in securing your affection. One day you acknowledged that you loved me, and since that day my hope of future happiness has rested on obtaining you, for to gain you would be life to me. Now I think no more. I say only that fortune has turned against me. I had thought to gain heaven, and now I have lost it. It is an everyday occurrence for a gambler to lose not only what he possesses, but also what he has not." Morel pronounced these words with perfect calmness. Valentine looked at him a moment with her large, scrutinizing eyes, endeavoring not to let Morel discover the grief which struggled in her heart. "But in a word, what are you going to do?" asked she. "I am going to have the honor of taking my leave of you, mademoiselle, solemnly assuring you that I wish your life may be so calm, so happy, and so fully occupied that there may be no place for me even in your memory." "Oh," murmured Valentine. "Adieu, Valentine, adieu," said Morel, bowing. "Where are you going?" cried the young girl, extending her hand through the opening, and seizing Maximilian by his coat, for she understood from her own agitated feelings that her lover's calmness could not be real. "Where are you going?" "I am going that I may not bring fresh trouble into your family, and to set an example which every honest and devoted man, situated as I am, may follow." "Before you leave me, tell me what you are going to do, Maximilian." The young man smiled sorrowfully. "Speak, speak," said Valentine, "I entreat you." "Has your resolution changed, Valentine?" "It cannot change, unhappy man, you know it must not," cried the young girl. "Then adieu, Valentine." Valentine shook the gate with a strength of which she could not have been supposed to be possessed, as Morel was going away, and passing both her hands through the opening, she clasped and wrung them. "I must know what you mean to do," said she. "Where are you going?" "Oh, fear not," said Maximilian, stopping at a short distance. "I do not intend to render another man responsible for the rigorous fate reserved for me. Another might threaten to seek Monsieur Franz, to provoke him and to fight with him. All that would be folly. What has Monsieur Franz to do with it? He saw me this morning for the first time, and has already forgotten he has seen me. He did not even know I existed when it was arranged by your two families that you should be united. I have no enmity against Monsieur Franz, and promise you the punishment shall not fall on him." "On whom, then? On me?" "On you? Valentine! Oh, heaven forbid! Woman is sacred. The woman one loves is holy." "On yourself, then, unhappy man, on yourself?" "I am the only guilty person, am I not?" said Maximilian. "Maximilian," said Valentine, "Maximilian, come back, I entreat you." He drew near with his sweet smile, and but for his paleness one might have thought him in his usual happy mood. "Listen, my dear, my adored Valentine," said he in his melodious and grave voice. "Those who, like us, have never had a thought for which we need blush before the world, such may read each other's hearts. I never was romantic, and am no melancholy hero. I imitate neither Manfred nor Anthony, but without words, protestations, or vows, my life has entwined itself with yours. You leave me, and you are right in doing so. I repeat it, you are right, but in losing you, I lose my life. The moment you leave me, Valentine, I am alone in the world. My sister is happily married, her husband is only my brother-in-law, that is, a man whom the ties of social life alone attach to me. No one then longer needs my useless life. This is what I shall do. I will wait until the very moment you are married, for I will not lose the shadow of one of those unexpected chances which are sometimes reserved for us, since Monsieur Franz may, after all, die before that time. A thunderbolt may fall even on the altar as you approach it. Nothing appears impossible to one condemned to die, and miracles appear quite reasonable when his escape from death is concerned. I will, then, wait until the last moment, and when my misery is certain, irredeemable, hopeless, I will write a confidential letter to my brother-in-law, another to the prefect of police, to acquaint them with my intention, and at the corner of some wood, on the brink of some abyss, on the bank of some river, I will put an end to my existence, as certainly as I am the son of the most honest man who ever lived in France." Valentine trembled convulsively. She loosened her hold of the gate, her arms fell by her side, and 2 large tears rolled down her cheeks. The young man stood before her, sorrowful and resolute. "Oh, for pity's sake," said she, "you will live, will you not?" "No, on my honor," said Maximilian, "but that will not affect you. You have done your duty, and your conscience will be at rest." Valentine fell on her knees and pressed her almost bursting heart. "Maximilian," said she, "Maximilian, my friend, my brother on earth, my true husband in heaven, I entreat you, do as I do, live in suffering. Perhaps we may one day be united." "Adieu, Valentine," repeated Morrel. "My God," said Valentine, raising both her hands to heaven with a sublime expression, "I have done my utmost to remain a submissive daughter. I have begged, entreated, implored. He has regarded neither my prayers, my entreaties, nor my tears. It is done," cried she, willing away her tears, and resuming her firmness. "I am resolved not to die of remorse, but rather of shame. Live, Maximilian, and I will be yours. Say when it shall be. Speak, command, I will obey." Morrel, who had already gone some few steps away, again returned, and pale with joy, extended both hands towards Valentine through the opening. "Valentine," he said, "dear Valentine, you must not speak thus; rather let me die. Why should I obtain you by violence, if our love is mutual? Is it from mere humanity you bid me live? I would then rather die." "Truly," murmured Valentine, "who on this earth cares for me if he does not? Who has consoled me in my sorrow but he? On whom do my hopes rest? On whom does my bleeding heart repose? On him, always on him. Yes, you are right, Maximilian, I will follow you. I will leave the paternal home, I will give up all." "Oh, ungrateful girl that I am!" cried Valentine, sobbing. "I will give up all, even my dear old grandfather, whom I had nearly forgotten." "No," said Maximilian, "you shall not leave him. Monsieur Noirtier has evinced, you say, a kind feeling